Subcommittee on Oversight and Accountability will come to order. Purpose of this hearing is to examine the Biden administration's sanctions policy and its use, implementation, and enforcement of sanctions on a range of malign actors. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Thank you. So today, the Subcommittee on Oversight and Accountability will begin examining the implementation and enforcement of U.S. export controls as a part of the committee's 90-day review of the Department of Commerce's Bureau of Industry and Security, or BIS. There's a lot of buzzwords being thrown around these days. We spoke about a lot of them in my office in the last couple days. People like to talk about strategic competition. President Biden has used the phrases seeking competition, not conflict. But I want to cut through some of the D.C. bull and say it's not competition if one boxer doesn't step into the ring. And it's completely, undeniably, 100% unacceptable that American soldiers, men and women like ourselves, may have to one day be forced to stare down the barrel of an American-made weapon because the Biden administration has let the People's Republic of China get its hands on our tech. Members of this subcommittee on both sides of the dais have served our country in uniform honorably. We don't see eye to eye on every single policy issue, but I do know that we agree on this. When our men and women are staring down at enemy forces across the battlefield, our weapons and our will better be better than theirs. And there's no reason on God's green earth that we should be willing to be handing over our weapons to our enemy, or the means to build those weapons. I'd like to begin today's hearing by comparing and contrasting Xi Jinping and Joe Biden's approach to the relationship between our two nations. Let's be clear that Xi Jinping is gearing up for a fight. He's preparing for conflict by being more competitive. Pictured behind me is the DF-17. It's the People's Liberation Army first ground-launched hypersonic glide vehicle designed for anti-ship missions. China's state media refer to it as the aircraft killer. Everybody should be asking themselves, whose aircraft carrier do you think this missile is designed to kill? What sailors do you think it is designed to end the lives of? Xi has told his military he wants capability to attack Taiwan by 2027. He's told his generals to dare to fight. He's ready for a fight, and he's ready to do everything he can to make sure that China wins. That includes getting his hands on American tech, using our supply to his advantage. I brought a few articles that illustrate this point. Let's read a couple of these headlines. The Washington Post on October 17, 2022. American technology boosts China's hypersonic missile program. Washington Post again on April 9, 2021. China builds advanced weapons system using American ship technology. The fact is that failure to stop transfer and espionage of critical American technology to the People's Republic of China has contributed to its rapid military modernization and the rapid decrease in the United States' national security. Let's put a finer point on it. The Chinese Communist Party is using American technology to build more precise, more lethal weapons to sink our carriers and to kill our troops. That is Xi Jinping's plan. If Xi Jinping is gearing up for a fight, Joe Biden, in my opinion, is doing the opposite of that. He's desperate to appease the enemy, even if it means giving away our own military's advantage. Remember, we're not looking for a fight. That was the statement. We're looking for competition. But as the great General Patton said, real Americans love to fight. They love the clash and the sting of battle. At the heart of his appeasement strategy is Commerce's Bureau of Industry and Security, the agency's authority over export controls. Its seeming refusal to use that authority, it's infuriating because I can sit here and say that, yes, China is in fact stealing our technology, but more concerning, the administration is willing to hand it over to them, even in the midst of them being thieves. Let's look at the facts. During a 6-month period between November 2020 and April 2021, BIS approved $60 billion worth of licenses for American technology to Huawei and $40 billion worth of licenses to SMIC. It's denied less than 1% of licenses to both companies. 98% of controlled technologies are transferred to China without license. Of the 1% of exports that do need a license, only 2% of those licenses are denied. The Commerce Control List is more than 500 pages long, but it seems that every entity has a license exception, and even when a license is required, it's rubber stamped and sent back out the door. We have laws and regulations that fill binders upon binders upon binders, and there's just some simple stacks of them that my staff has put together, but they're wasted words if we don't actually enforce them. Our yes has to be yes, our no has to be no. Our adversaries have to take our country and our administration seriously. It's because of, in my opinion, Joe Biden's refusal to lead through strength that's not being done. While Xi Jinping is ready for a fight, President Biden is that guy with a quivering lip that won't look the bully in the eye and say, no, I'm going to stand up to you. That's not going to be allowed. You're not going to do that. So let's talk about how we fix this. The answer is actually implementing export controls in part. Congress gave the executive branch considerable authority in the Export Control Reform Act of 2018 to protect our national security, but the Biden administration is failing to implement it, including blatant refusal to even define emerging and critical technologies as the law requires. It's ironic, really, that the administration seems to determine to overstep its authority in almost every case, but now that it has the ability to do something to keep Americans safe, it says no thanks. But that refusal to act is a slap in the face to those who sent us here to represent them. A March 2023 Morning Consult poll found that 1 in 2 voters support restricting American companies from exporting to or doing business in China when it comes to advancing their technologies. Some of our friends on K Street who lobby against tough export controls like to overcomplicate things. They make the system out to be more intimidating and confusing than it really is. But when I'm back home, my constituents tend to keep things pretty simple. Don't sell American technology to an adversary that can be used to kill Americans. Today, we're going to hear testimony from leading experts, including former Commerce and DoD officials. One of them ran BIS, another led DITSA's counter-China work until he resigned in protest. They will tell us firsthand how broken our export and control system is and where we can work to fix it together. This hearing is just a starting point for the subcommittee's oversight of BIS and its use of export controls. In coming months, we plan to invite BIS officials to testify and answer for these failures. Export controls are about ensuring America is taken seriously on the global stage. We cannot be the nation of all talk and no action, of empty threats. Our actions have to match our words. Export controls are about national security, and as a soldier, when my brothers and sisters in arms are in that same position, I want them to know that their weapons can blow our enemies off the face of the earth and not have to worry that our enemies have the same capability to do that to them. Export controls are about beating China. I firmly believe that we have to run faster than our enemies, but we should not be working at all to give them any kind of capability to catch up. And China is ready for that fight. Chair now recognizes the very distinguished, the very honorable ranking member, the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Crow, for any opening statement. And if it goes too long, I'm certainly not going to gavel you down. That would be very hypocritical of me. So the chair now recognizes you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the additional runway. I don't think I will need it, but appreciate you calling this really important hearing today. Before I begin, I just wanted to note a little bit of my disappointment and two of the witnesses providing materials far past the required deadline when those materials by rule are normally allowed. It just makes it hard for members to prepare for the hearing, for staff to prepare for hearing, and for us to really get out of these hearings the full full measure of our oversight if we don't have those materials in advance, and would just ask that in future testimony for both of those witnesses that they do comply with that rule, and I appreciate that. So with that, today we are going to examine the Biden administration's use of export controls and broader U.S. export control policy and the role of the Department of Commerce Bureau of Industry and Security, or BIS, in carrying out those policies. The U.S. economic might, if properly wielded through cooperation with our thriving private sector, as well as allies and partners, can serve as a multiplier for advancing U.S. national security and boosting our economic competitiveness in the face of strategic competition with the PRC. One of the most important ways we can wield that power is through the smart and effective imposition of export controls. Now, export controls can be used to cut off access to American products, intellectual property, and technologies that bad actors would use to undermine U.S. security, violate human rights, and circumvent international law. This is one way in which the U.S. government can pull the economic levers at our disposal, and it is a tool the Biden administration has used repeatedly and robustly, and arguably more than any previous administration, and I would say to great effect. Now, that's not to say they're perfect, because the very nature of export controls is you are evolving, you're looking at data, you're responding to the information that you see in real time, and you continue to evolve those and improve those. They are, by nature, dynamic and changing. But the Biden administration's use of export controls has been broad, it has been expansive and historic, particularly in countering China and Russia. In response to Russia's renewed invasion of Ukraine, the administration swiftly built a coalition with 38 other countries, imposing stringent export controls on Russia and Belarus, the largest and most coordinated effort of its kind in history outside of the multilateral regime. In just over 2 years, it has listed hundreds of PRC-based entities, including through its October 2022 controls, which took unprecedented steps to restrict the PRC from obtaining advanced computing chips, developing and maintaining supercomputers, and manufacturing advanced semiconductors. Critical allies like Japan and the Netherlands have announced their plans to impose their own controls, a demonstration of the strength of U.S. leadership and welcome development to multilateralize our policies on China. Our controls are most effective when implemented alongside partners, and I hope today's discussion can shed light on how we can enhance international coordination on export controls. Today, the U.S. uses export controls more often and for a greater number of policy objectives than ever before. That's just a fact. BIS adapts and strengthens its rules on an ongoing basis, as I mentioned earlier, responding and evolving as the conditions require. Similarly, it is important that Congress conduct oversight to ensure that our controls are calibrated to achieve our objectives and ensure they are not causing unintended consequences to U.S. interests. We are engaged in an economic and technological competition with the PRC, especially when it comes to critical technologies that will define the future. To win this competition, we need to do two things simultaneously with our controls. First, as the Biden administration has done, we must not export sensitive and advanced critical technology to China that would undermine our national security. We all share that goal. Second, we must ensure that our controls are focused and narrow so they are not unduly impeding or undermining our own U.S. economic strength and allowing our companies to become global leaders in these technologies. It's a delicate balancing act, but to win the strategic competition, it's critical that we do both. This is why Congress must conduct honest, constructive oversight and ensure that BIS has the tools and resources it needs to do its job effectively. Having imposed unprecedented controls on China and Russia in the past year, Congress must ensure that BIS has the proper staffing and resources to effectively implement and enforce those controls, as well as to maintain a swift, transparent, and rigorous licensing application and approval system. BIS's staffing and budget have frankly not kept up with the growing mandate that we have given it. For this reason, I hope this committee also gets the chance to hear from the administration directly. So with that said, I hope we can spend some time today on productive oversight that highlights where BIS can improve, how we can strengthen coordination with partners and allies and export controls even further, and how we can give BIS the tools and resources it needs to enforce our already existing policies effectively. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
We both went over. I'll call it even. Even. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. We are pleased to have a distinguished panel of witnesses before us today on this important topic. We thank you all for being here. The Honorable Ms. Nazak Nikakhtar is the Chair of National Security Practice at Willie Rain, LLP, and was the former Assistant Secretary for Industry and Analysis at the International Trade Administration. Mr. Steve Koonin was the former Senior Foreign Affairs Advisor for the Defense Technology Security Administration. The Honorable Kevin Wolf is a partner at Aiken Gump, Strauss-Hauer and Field, LLP, and a Senior Fellow at the Center for Security and Emerging Technology at Georgetown University. Mr. Wolf was also the former Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Export Administration. And Ms. Giovanni Cinelli is a National Security Fellow at the National Security Institute at George Mason's Antonin Scalia Law School. Thank you for being here today. Your full statements will be made a part of the record, and I'll ask that each of you keep your spoken remarks to 5 minutes exactly, like he and I both did, in order to allow time for member questions. I now recognize Ms. Nikakhtar for her opening statement.
Chairman Mast, Ranking Member Crow, committee members and staff, thank you for the invitation and opportunity to speak today. As a lawyer, economist, former adjunct university professor, and former U.S. government official, I've been on the front lines for the U.S. economic challenge for decades. I've served two tours in the U.S. government, Department of Commerce, spanning 4 important positions, including acting Undersecretary of BIS. I am also an immigrant, a woman who escaped an authoritarian regime nearly 45 years ago. I am acutely aware of what such regimes are capable of. They do not think like Americans. Capitalism is not in their interest. What they seek is the destruction of America and Western values. That is their end game above all else. It is from all of these vantage points as a patriot, an immigrant, and an expert that I offer my views today. The views and opinions expressed today are mine only and no organization with which I'm affiliated. In my written testimony, I take the position that we need more forward-leaning policies to curb the exports of sensitive items to America's adversaries. I also take the position that Congress needs much more transparency in how exports are being regulated to better evaluate the ways that the Commerce Department is addressing very serious national security risks. I make the case that America was stronger 20 years ago, both in terms of economic resilience and in terms of military power, before it let its technology and manufacturing capacity move offshore to the PRC. The PRC, in turn, poured enormous amounts of money to indigenize and grow the innovations we willingly transferred to it. China also transferred our technologies to other adversaries for its own benefit and to our detriment. Now, America let its technology offshore because we mistakenly believed that we needed the revenue from the Chinese market to innovate. But the money received pales in comparison to the value of the technology we transferred to China, coupled with the subsidies that the Chinese government used to mature these innovations into powerhouse mammoth industries that span across China today and are crushing competitors globally. We lost, they won, and China is now leading the world in many of the important technologies. Make no mistake, in semiconductors, a very apt example, China has developed the equipment, wafer fabrication capabilities, the design technology, and the upstream supply chains to dominate the global sector. Its immense control over the critical upstream supply chains also gives it leverage to destroy the chip sector of all other competitors. Let me be clear, China no longer needs us. With our technology, it can make both legacy and advanced chips and leading-edge chips. Is its throughput at the 7-nanometer level great? No, but China can handle 30% yields because money is an issue for the Chinese government. Plus, the yields are going to improve over time. In comparison, we have neither the IP, the manufacturing capacity to be self-sufficient across the full chip value chain. The reason, again, is that we chose to export our know-how in exchange for money. So where does that leave us today? Desperate. Desperate for domestic manufacturing capacity, desperate for IP, and desperate for the manufacturing raw materials. This is a direct result of our sell-for-revenue export control policies. China has been running faster than us, and it is running exponentially faster the stronger it gets by means of our exports. We have a very short period of time to reverse the current trend, which means that we have to move in big ways to make up for lost time. Finally, I want to note that tightening controls in the way I recommend will not force American companies to offshore. The Indo-Pacific region is becoming dangerously unstable geopolitically. Europe is dealing with a historic energy crisis that precludes long-term investments in energy-sensitive tech industries. And our other trading partners in Asia and South America don't have the skilled workforce or the infrastructure to support high-tech manufacturing and R&D right now. To the extent that American companies offshore, they risk the possibility that their companies will be nationalized. China already controls a majority stake in all the American companies that offshored there years ago. If it controls the companies now, it's certainly going to nationalize them tomorrow. This is obvious. America is still the great bet to invest, which is why I find so many incredible patriotic companies looking now to innovate in the US to outcompete our adversaries. Export controls, more aggressive export controls, will go a long way in giving these companies, these new startup companies, the runway they need to reclaim America's technological leadership. Thank you for having me, and I look forward to a discussion that is robust, guided by what's in America's best interest. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Nikokhtar. You nailed the time, so right on. I now recognize Mr. Coonan for his opening statement. We'll see if you can do any better on that front.
Thank you, Chairman Mass. Good afternoon, Ranking Member Crow and members of the committee. My name is Steve Coonan. It is an honor for me to be here to testify with you today. Following more than 2 decades in uniform as a U.S. Army artillery officer and a foreign affairs officer, I spent nearly 14 years as an analyst at the Defense Technology Security Administration, or DTSA. It's the Pentagon's unit for developing export controls and technology security policies. By the end of my tour, I was DTSA's senior foreign advisor for China. In this position, I had the responsibility of preventing China from obtaining sensitive American technologies. In July of 2020, the Office of the Secretary of Defense bestowed on me an award for excellence for my work on China. But then in November of 2021, I voluntarily resigned in protest from my position. I could no longer, in good conscience, continue to serve when I believe that too many officials refused to recognize and correct U.S. export policy failures concerning China. I felt like I was watching a car crash in slow motion every time the federal government approved a technology transfer that fed the buildup of an adversarial Chinese military and furthered their modernization efforts. Too few inside the system seemed willing to recognize this danger. I've submitted to you my written statement, which was also released yesterday by the China tech threat. My thesis is that willful blindness characterizes the various actors regulating technology sales to Chinese entities. Their refusal to stop China from legally capturing American technology undermines American national security and dishonors our forces' willingness to sacrifice for our country. At the center of the export control system is Commerce Department's Bureau of Industry and Security, or BIS. In my view, BIS is failing to prioritize national security in its decision-making. BIS is grossly underestimating Xi Jinping's military-civil fusion strategy, which is diverting dual-use technologies to the People's Liberation Army. As evidenced in BIS's report on U.S. trade with China that was just released this week, in 2022, BIS approved 91% of applications with the export of controlled militarily useful technology to China. From my vantage point, the main problem is that BIS takes a business-first view of applications. Though there are scores of military uses for controlled technologies, BIS will rubber stamp applications unless they have specific indications or intelligence of diversion. The problem with this approach is it's obviously extremely difficult to obtain intelligence of PLA diversion. Even though we know it's happening, such as the case of China's hypersonics and using American technology to develop that controlled technology. Second, Xi Jinping himself has told us through his military-civil fusion strategy, the CCP will divert any technology for military purposes. So we shouldn't need formal evidence of diversion. China's assertion that they will use this technology for civilian purposes are lies from a regime that is characterized by dishonesty and non-transparency. Third, unlike every other trading partner, the U.S. has no effective mechanism to verify how controlled U.S. technology exported to China is ultimately used. In close, we are failing to recognize the significant and decades-long shortcomings associated with having a federal bureaucracy whose inherent interests are not necessarily aligned with our national security interests. Given the length of time that these problems have endured over several administrations, be it Republican or Democrat, I believe only Congress can implement the needed change. My paper offers 8 specific suggestions, but in deference to time limitations, I'd urge you to quickly implement the following 3 recommendations to fix our broken export control system. First, make the presumption of denial the standard position for national security controlled technologies and other critical technologies bound for the PRC. Second, give the Departments of Defense, State, and Energy greater authorities to determine the outcomes of a BIS-dominated license process review, and enhance their ability to quickly add controls for emerging and unlicensed technologies for which they have the greatest equity. And then third, request a GAO audit. I note a number of BIS process flaws in my paper. A GAO audit should be conducted immediately to assess the risk that those violations are causing to national security. That audit should also contain recommendations. I look forward to discussing these issues in greater detail with you, and again, thank you for having me today.
Thank you, Mr. Coonan. It was a good 7,000-word read, and I mean that. So I now recognize Mr. Wolf for his opening statement.
Great. Chairman Mast, Ranking Member Crow, members of the subcommittee, thank you for asking me to testify. I'm happy to help the subcommittee with its oversight role in any way that I can. The views I expressed today are my own. To help set the stage a little bit for the hearing, I thought it might be useful to list out some of the major and rather significant export control actions that BIS, working with its interagency partners, took in 2022. On the one hand, the changes are quite novel in that they focus on responding to, as the title of this hearing is, strategic national security threats created by specific countries, namely China and Russia, as opposed to the more classical country-agnostic, non-proliferation-focused regime-based controls that govern the system and focused on dual-use items since the end of the Cold War. And these are the types of items historically that were controlled that had a much more direct relationship to the development, production, or use of a weapon of mass destruction or a conventional weapon. And the recent controls from 2022 are much broader in scope. They use a combination of really novel and quite complex end-use, end-user, and list-based controls, lists of specific items, and controls that are extraterritorial, meaning that they apply to foreign-made items even when they're outside the U.S. And another way of thinking about it is, even when otherwise basic commercial items that are not normally subject to U.S. or any non-U.S. controls are involved, the new controls that came about in 2022 apply to activities of U.S. persons and trade an otherwise uncontrolled item with many more specific entities of concern in Russia and China and elsewhere. But on the other hand, the controls are not new, in the sense that BIS's mission has always been to administer an interagency export control system and an enforcement system, which I want to get into, that governs the activities involving specific items, end uses, end users, and destinations in order to advance national security and protect national security and foreign policy interests. The difference is that the national security and foreign policy objectives of export controls that were created at the end of the Cold War have, and properly so, expanded to deal with the broader strategic issues that involve, in particular, China and Russia. And the evolution of this policy thinking is best set out by the administration in 2 speeches that the National Security Advisor has given and in the preambles that BIS wrote for the 2 primary Russia and China-specific rules that are set out. And in essence, with respect to export controls, the national security objectives clearly include broader China and Russia-specific strategic objectives with respect to what the National Security Advisor calls force-multiplying technologies and enabling technologies. And as described in far more detail in other testimony that I've given My view is that there are two keys to making these and other follow-on strategic controls far more effective and less counterproductive. And by more effective, I primarily mean coming up with rules and systems that stop the transfer of the technology of concern to end users and destinations of concern from any destination. And the first key to success in this objective is to do all the hard work to ensure that our allies that also make similar technologies and that have producers of the items of concern have the authority in their systems to impose controls over the same items for the same end users, and same destinations. And so it's important that they have an understanding of a common security objective that we are all discussing today in order to enhance the effectiveness of controls. The thing that I've been preaching about is more authority for the allies so that they can impose with us plurilateral controls, and eventually my ideal is an additional multilateral regime system focus on non-classical national security and human rights issues. Now, I'm not saying that all unilateral controls are bad or counterproductive. It's just that, as ECRA clearly lays out, eventually they become less effective and more counterproductive. And the second key that I will discuss today in much more detail is the need for massively larger resources for BIS. BIS and its other agencies are doing great work. But the demands of the day imposed upon BIS and the other export control agencies are far, far greater than what they were originally created for. BIS and the other agencies are processing 40,000 plus licenses and other requests in addition to all the novel controls and issues, particularly with respect to enforcement of the Russia and China controls. So that's right at about my 5-minute mark, and I stand ready to answer whatever questions now or later, however I can help. So thank you very much.
I want to thank you, Mr. Wolf. I now recognize Ms. Ginelli for her opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Mast and Ranking Member Crow and distinguished members of the subcommittee. I very much appreciate the opportunity to come before you today to provide some perspectives from both a longstanding legal career where I've had to advise in this area from a client perspective to operationalize the requirements that the Export Administration regulations and the underlying statutes have imposed, and at the same time from my military service as a U.S. Naval Intelligence Officer, where I have seen firsthand the actual impact of export controls out in the field and in a boots-on-the-ground perspective. I am here today in my capacity as a National Security Fellow from the National Security Institute. The views that I'm expressing are my own. They do not represent any individual or other organization. As my co-panelists have said, export controls are all about national security. And national security is predicated on both a proactive and a reactive strategy. If a national security foundation is predicated only on the ability to react to ongoing circumstances, that will place any country, not only the United States, in a defensive posture, and one in which you are almost shadowboxing because you're not sure where a particular issue will arise. So as we look at the export control system today, we see that the majority of what has been described by my co-panelists is focused on that reactive nature. As we look at effectiveness and we look at the protection of U.S. national security interests, it would be helpful to look historically of where today's system originally arose. And I take it back to the 1970s, when we had the first Export Administration Act that was predicated upon the geopolitical and geostrategic situation at that time. And at that time, it was effective. Why? Because it was premised primarily on a deny and delay concept, which matched where allies, partners in the United States was at the time. There was a capability to deny access to parties, not just specific parties, but parties more generally, and to also delay the advancement. That premise was coupled with an effective strategy by the Department of Defense in the maintenance of various lists, like the Militarily Critical Technologies List and the Disruptive Technologies List. And DITSA did yeoman's work up through the 1990s to attempt to maintain that list until a combined set of factors, not only resources, but focus and changing balances within the government on who and under what circumstances made decisions in the national security realm. I think these lessons are important as you look at the work that your committee is considering doing, as you understand where and how there may be gaps, and in some instances deficiencies, in the operationalization of the EAR. I think it stands on three legs of the stool. First, while export controls require flexibility, focus, and nimbleness, if the rules are so complicated and so convoluted that in order to implement them, you need a technical person, an economist, and a lawyer, the question becomes, how are they best protecting interests? The second leg of the stool is funding. When the regulations and the underlying premise for export controls shifted in the 1990s from a deny and delay perspective to a run faster, there was an inherent need to maintain a degree of funding for the development of that delta to run faster. And at the time in the Clinton administration, while there was some aspect of a continuation of deny and delay, the transition to shifting almost everything to the Run Faster coalition resulted in gaps. Why? Because the funding was not there on the government side to keep the delta that had been in place, and on the industry side and the academic community side, where the majority of the advancements were beginning to transition, the funding priorities, the focus, and the direction varied. This is not to say there were not circumstances when they were aligned, but they were not completely aligned, and you had different drivers. I fast forward to 2018 with ECRA, where Congress wisely reallocated a substantial substantive statute, in essence giving the Department of Commerce substantive authority. For so many years, from 1994 through 2018, Commerce and the Export Administration regulations were premised on emergency powers under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. That was not a sufficient authority. And with that, I see that my time is up. I am happy to answer any questions, and I apologize, Chairman Mast, for my 6 minutes being over.
I didn't think you went over by maybe 10 seconds. You're good, ma'am. Thank you, Ms. Cinelli. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. I'm going to take a point of privilege and say we have in the audience the members of the Palm Beach Police Department that joined us here in our committee. I just want to say thank you all for your service to our community and our country. Appreciate you all very much. So I want to get into this conversation, a place that's interested me personally. Before I get into that, I want to ask more of a broad question, and it's simply this, and I'm going to ask Ms. Nakaktar and Mr. Coonan. Would you say that for Department of Commerce that they're primarily driven to enhance American commerce or to safeguard American national security interests, just broadly?
I'm happy to answer that. I've served multiple different roles at the Commerce Department. Look, the Commerce Department's bifurcated, right? You've got the pro-business group, and that's pretty much the majority of the Commerce Department. But you do have already a unit of the Commerce Department that handles enforcement of trade cases, and they do that pretty well. Within BIS, you have the enforcement group. They're very forward-leaning. They're very enforcement-minded. And then you've got the licensing folks, which are a little bit less so. Fundamentally, one can have the debate about whether commerce is capable of doing this. What I think needs to happen at BIS is a complete culture shift on the licensing side. They need to see the threats for what it is, and they need to really understand that continuing to do business with China and the revenue stream we get from them is not going to be the ticket out of this mess. We have decades of evidence to show that that strategy has failed. Mm-hmm. Fundamentally, I think commerce can do both, but we need a culture shift.
I think that's an important term, fundamentally, and it takes me to what I really wanted to ask about, and that's fundamental research as it relates to what we're allowing China and others to learn. There's an old saying, right? You give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. You teach him to fish, you feed him for life. And you could almost say that we're helping to grow them and feed them for life with what we're doing. So for any of you, I would love to hear analysis on what needs to be changed with the fundamental research exception, what controls need to be updated on that. Should companies on the entity list be able to participate in fundamental research? Where are some of the places that you've seen this play out in generating problems for the United States of America? Maybe some other questions in there. How big of a risk does the CCP penetration of university research programs pose to the United States of America? And if you all could touch on that, I think it would be very worthwhile information for us to hear.
I'm happy, again, to start on it since I've written about it in my testimony.
Let's let Mr. Coonan start a minute. We like to share the wealth a little bit.
Sir, I would just jumping back to your other question, I think it's important to note, to answer your question of whether commerce is focused on business commercial interests over national security interests. I think for an export control system to be effective, it needs to be predictable. And so for all of our partners and allies, I would suggest that we do have a very predictable system and that they are able to get the capabilities they need. I think where that line starts to shift from a business perspective to the national security, where we need to focus more on the national security perspective, at least within BIS, is when we start to talk about our adversaries. And there, I think they haven't made that shift that has evolved over time, where initially we were more open and welcoming to the People's Republic of China, but now it's an obvious threat, and that it seems as though that mentality, that fundamental shift, has not occurred yet to focus from a business perspective to a more national security, to defend our national security interests. Thank you.
No, I appreciate that. And anybody care to touch on fundamental research in our universities?
So I'll
Ms.
add that.
Nikoktar, please.
Yeah, I'll add, our universities are civ. We've got China's 1,000 talent programs. We've got similar programs in other countries. The technology that's already controlled isn't controlled when it's kind of called fundamental research. You do some basic research, advanced research from that, and then if you intend to publish, it essentially falls out of the scope of controls. Why not take every single thing on the Commerce Control List right now and just tell the universities, for foreign countries of concern, we don't need to do it broadly, foreign countries of concern, no more fundamental research exception. Even if you intend to publish, you need to get a license from BIS before you do that, or whatever entity ends up handling export controls on dual-use items.
I'd love to ask more about that, but my time has expired. I now recognize Ranking Member Crow for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to pick up on this line of questioning about in this theme that Commerce Department is somehow ill-equipped to handle issues of national security and kind of that general thrust. I sit on the Intelligence Committee, I've sat on the Armed Services Committee, and what I see is a rapidly evolving landscape where more and more of our defense procurement and acquisition and more of the new technologies that are being fielded are COTS, or commercial off the shelf, right? That is kind of the future of a lot of defense acquisition, because it's cheaper, it's more rapidly fielded, it's more attritable. So, Mr. Wolf, I'd like to just kind of hear from you, your views. You've been in BIS, you've been in private practice, your career has straddled both public and private for many decades. What's your view as to that trend and Commerce Department, their ability to fully understand the national security impact and balance those equities between private innovation and commercial off-the-shelf technology, but also the best interests of U.S. national security?
Yes, no, the mission of BIS, when I was there, when Isaac was there, now and before, is to advance and protect our national security interests. I don't think there's any doubt about that. It administers an interagency system involving subject matter experts from defense, state, energy, and occasionally others to get input into both identifying what the threats are and making decisions on individual transactions. With respect to the core point of your question, and as Giovanna, basically was alluding to, the national security landscape and the national security objectives of controls have evolved considerably. During the Cold War, they had a much broader strategic objective. After the Cold War, they became much more narrowly focused on items that were more specific to nonproliferation objectives, and they were focused through a regime-based system of 4 multilateral organizations that identified items that had a much more direct relationship to the development, production, or use of weapons. And it was easier to tell the difference between a civil and a commercial and military application in the earlier days. All of those things have been evolving and changed. The national security threat landscape with respect to China has become far more complicated, similarly with respect to Russia and other countries. Identifying specific types of items that used to be the foundation of an export control system is not always as effective when the underlying activity of concern is with respect to a widely available commercial item, particularly, for example, on human rights abuses, use widely available commercial items, and some of the modernization of advanced military systems fundamentally depend upon things that are widely available commercially and were created civilly. And so that is why, as the title of this hearing indicates, and the objective of the rules that came out in 2022 focus much broader on broader strategic objectives and a greater use of controls over activities of individual persons when the underlying item is not controlled, and controls over transactions with specific end users of concern. And all of this added complexity, the novel technologies, the greater number of countries involved, the more bilateral relationships, the weaknesses of the regime system, particularly since Russia is a member of 3 of the 4 and has effectively a veto over progress in those, requires, I think, fundamentally a new way of thinking about the way we work with our allies, and our allies realize a common security threat in order to address the issues that we're all discussing today. And that requires a lot more resources. It's far more complex to do what I just described with a lot more time, a lot more briefing papers, a lot more meetings, a lot more analytical skills and technical skills than was the case in the 1990s when the current system was created. And I lay out the details in my commentary about why I think radically more resources are needed for BIS and their sister agencies.
Thank you, Mr. Wolf. In less than a minute, I also wanted to take the opportunity and correct the record regarding an earlier assertion about the nature of licenses and exceptions to Huawei. There was a comment made that the Biden administration has somehow been weak in Huawei. But isn't it true that it was actually the prior administration that granted licenses and exceptions to Huawei, and that since the Biden administration has come in, they've actually tightened the rules around Huawei?
Yes. Historically, before Huawei, it was generally a denial for listed entities, and I'm unaware of any approvals when I was Assistant Secretary. There may have been some, but I don't know of any. And Huawei was the first principal case where there was a policy of granting licenses to a listed entity. And that started in the, I think, August or September of 2019, was formalized in August of 2020. And there's a Reuters article today, a story about a potential apparent change, a plan to change that August of 2020 policy. So, yes.
Thank you. My time is out. I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Crow. Chair now recognizes Mr. Perry for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Nakakhtar, just under the China policy, corporations, I think if the CCP demands it, are required to share information with the party on technology. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct.
Yeah. So it's safe. I think it's safe to say that the CCP gets their hands on any technology they want, if it's come from America or anywhere else for that matter, into the hands of a Chinese corporation. If they want it, they're getting it.
If it goes to a seemingly innocuous corporation, the CCP will get its hands on it if it wants it.
So according to BIS's most recent data, fewer than 1% of U.S. exports require a license, and of that less than 1%, 98% of those applications are approved. Is that close? Is that correct?
It's astounding when you're looking at this narrow subset of what's on the Commerce Control List, and you narrow it down with all the exemptions. You narrow it down with what doesn't require a license. And then within that, you're looking at 90+% approval rate and very little denial rate for items that are dual use. Dual use meaning, yes, it has commercial applications, but it also has military applications. Every item on the Commerce Control List is dual use. That's what we're licensing to an adversary that is threatening to harm the United States and our allies.
So we're not really stopping any, I mean, appreciably, it's less than 1%, right? We're not really stopping any technology in a meaningful sort of getting into the CCP. Now, entities on the entity list are typically subject to a presumption of denial licensing policy. Do you think that BIS is faithfully implementing that when it approves 98% of license applications? Do you think they're following that, or is there some reason that it? Look, it sounds astounding to me. What are we missing here?
I mean, it's pretty horrific that when you look at the entity list, you have out of the approximately 473 Chinese companies on the entity list, if you take into account the affiliates, 81% of them have licensing policies that have a case-by-case license review mechanism, which for all intents and purposes, minus a little bit of details, essentially removes them from the entity list. I mean, what are we doing? These guys are put on the entity list and then get treatment from somebody that's not on the entity list. It's absurd.
So I'm looking at two things here. You said in your testimony that we need to move in big ways, but I don't think I was listening to see if you were going to elaborate on that. And then in your testimony, you talk about BIS being more transparent with the process, I guess, so that we and the American people can see how they're approving things. And can you speak to the, if nothing else, the move in big ways? We get the transparency thing. Can you give us like two or three? What are the big moves?
Yeah, absolutely. So look, it's a really low threshold to be on the entity list, right? And so we should be designating many, many more companies. The fact that around 473 of the entire Chinese industry, Chinese military and complex is absurd. We need to be designating more. Don't fear litigation. Defend the actions if they're right in the interest of national security. Also, we're not adequately designating subsidiaries and affiliates. I've worked trade. I have the unique ability to know everything in the trade laws that have been upheld by the highest courts of the country and are WTO consistent. Why are we not applying those laws, those regulations, that legal framework to determining affiliation? So a business that has close business ties with Huawei, right, like a company like Honor, that in the trade world would be deemed to be affiliated. We need to do the same for the entity list, and BIS is going to complain about the burden. We don't need BIS to designate every single affiliate. BIS issues regulations that says affiliates are now on the entity list. Industry, do your own due diligence, and if you cannot do your own due diligence, then don't export because the risk is too high.
Okay, I'm going to run out of time. Mr. Coonan, at some point, if you could comment on the presumption of denial that you talked about, but I want to get to Ms. Ginelli right now. CFIUS, in the 20 seconds I have left, broadly speaking, I feel like it's just not, I feel like it's not efficient, effective at all. Am I wrong, or what needs to be done there, or am I completely in the woods on that?
So I think I would call your question insightful. Any regulatory construct has deficiencies in it. Now, CFIUS, and I'm going to tie it to the export laws because through the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act of 2018 and ECRA, the Export Control Reform Act of 2018, for the first time there was a direct tie, sir, between export controls and CFIUS. So in one sense, it was designed to bring a national security overview that would grant CFIUS additional reach into different transactions, but at the same time, it acted like limitation. And what happens is these limitations come in, Congress proposes through legislation objectives to be met, but the executive branch is left with the interpretive capability to assess how that's implemented. And absent consistent oversight, and Congress is incredibly busy, and these are, as all my co-panelists have said, dense regulations and incredibly complicated, it allows the opportunity for too many things sometimes to slip through the cracks. And with CFIUS, just as with export controls, the systems are set up to be porous. And that's why considering different approaches sometimes to managing CFIUS and managing export controls to keep it proactive as well as reactive becomes an essential issue to continuously monitor.
Thank you for your indulgence, Chairman.
Chair now recognizes Ms. Titus for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I asked Ms. Sinelli, I appreciate your impressive resume, which you've told us about several times, but I think your results are spurious when you talk about 98% being accepted. We know that the regulations are long and in-depth, but we also know that they are constantly being updated. They are published, that they, I'm sorry? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm looking at the right person and saying the wrong name. Excuse me. I'm looking at you. They are constantly updated. They outline what items are available, which ones are allowed, what end uses are allowed, which ones are prohibited. So why would businesses take a lot of time, money, effort, and personnel to apply for something when they know it's not going to be approved? I don't think they do. But that's my opinion of the research. I would ask Mr. Wolf some questions. You say that there are two things that we need to do, and that you outline them in your report, but I'd like for you to talk about them a little more here. And they're common sense things. Our regulations aren't going to work very effectively if they're just unilateral. We need to have more of a multilateral approach. We've seen a little of that with Japan and the Netherlands. What about Australia? What can we do to encourage other nations to have that approach with us? Second, we need to put more resources into the effort. We need more technical, analytical resources because the world has become more complex. How do we do that? Do we need to designate perhaps an international coordinator or someone who has a higher level position to oversee this? And then the third thing I would just ask is, what about, we talk about a carrot and a stick, what about things like the CHIP Act, where we encourage development or manufacturing here, but we put restrictions on it so that we don't get into this export problem that concerns our both commercial and national security interests?
No, great questions. Thanks for the comments. And yes, it's generally the case. I'm a practitioner. I help people comply with the regulations. And when I tell them the license isn't going to be granted because of the policy and the regulations, they generally don't bother applying. It's not worth the time. Sometimes they do in order to get the denial for other reasons, but that's why the statistics are like they are. It's the same thing at the State Department, where the vast majority are approved. Same thing at CFIUS. The vast majority are approved. People don't make submissions for outcomes they know are going to be negative. If you don't like the policy and the regulation of approval, then focus on that, but the percentages aren't really the way to think about it that way. My principal advocacy with respect to making the rules more effective is that the Congress should work closely with the administration at working with the allies better to articulate a significantly expanded vision for the role and purpose and scope of export controls far beyond the more narrow, non-proliferation focused of the post-Cold War era. And in particular, I think that a coherent vision of the government coming together to say that export control should be used not only for items of classical non-proliferation concerns, but also for the broader strategic issues that we're all discussing today, that there needs to be the authority in each of the allies to impose controls outside of the regimes and not limited to the post-Cold War regimes, which each three of the four give Russia a veto. That there should be a multilateral organization and structure, or at least agreement among the allies to control items for human rights abuses. That doesn't exist at all. The allies just frankly need help on capacity building on enforcement. The U.S. is largely unique in its enforcement resources, and particularly with respect to Russia, to make the controls more effective. Thank you. We need coordination and cooperation of allies, and there needs to be much more intra-governmental coordination between allied country licensing and policy, as well as their enforcement resources. With respect to Australia, I'm a big advocate for substantial changes to the international traffic in arms regulations with respect to implementing AUKUS. There's legislation out there, the Torpedo Act, which I've read, which seems terrific. And it's basically what we tried to do when I was in government with respect to the export control reform effort in order to allow the government to spend more time focusing on countries of concern, reduce the burden on trade by and among and between close allies so long as there were sufficient protections in place. And AUKUS is the way to do it. With respect to somebody to focus on this is incredibly complicated work working with the allies. Diplomacy takes time and is hard, and the allies have very different views, depending upon the country and the agency, about thinking about export controls differently. and it requires a significant amount of resources and expertise in state, commerce, the other agencies, to work with the allies to come to what I believe requires a fundamentally new and expanded thinking about the role of export controls. And then my last comment is that there should be a specific office within the Commerce Department to evaluate the effectiveness and the impact of all these rules. The Treasury Department has recently created an office to do this with respect to sanctions, and surprisingly, there isn't anything like that at the Commerce Department. And we really, it's a lot of decisions based upon gut and, and anecdote and partial data, but no major system to collect data and organize it and analyze it to know the impact and what more can be done. So I've got a long list of recommendations and ideas, but those are ones that I think are directly responsive to your comments. Thank you for asking.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Titus. Chair now recognizes Mr. Mills for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to ask a question. With the war in Ukraine, you're seeing the use of U.S. technology being used in Iranian drones that has surfaced as a major problem. And Russia is now using these Iranian drones with deadly effect in Ukraine against the civilians. How can we address the specific problem of low-level technology that is widely available being exported to Iran for the use of drones? And I'll start with you, Ms. Nikakhtar.
One of the issues we have in the export administration regulations is this lack of a see-through rule, right? And so if you have technology that's embedded in something else, and if it doesn't meet this de minimis standard, then it really doesn't require a license. And that's how a lot of the things that we're getting to China is falling to our adversaries. Now, if items aren't controlled, right, we need to potentially, it's a really great question, we need to potentially really look at what that technology might be capable of, even if it's not controlled. Of course, advocate for controls, but then really think about whether we want to put in policies in place specifically for China, knowing that China has this massive, you all don't need me to tell you this, but China has a massive history of divergence, right? Diversion, where everything you send to it essentially goes to some malign actor, you can bet on it. So it's a broad solution, but depending on whether it's controlled or not, we can legally impose restrictions on what's going there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, especially as we look at the geopolitical alliances that have been forming over time with Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, knowing that they're sharing and utilizing technology in an effort to launch an economic resource warfare, not just kinetic, but utilizing different technologies and the advancement of this to try and help with the economic advancement and in some cases coercion of many of those to advance the Belt and Road Initiative. This same question, staying on topic, I'd like to ask you as well, Mr. Coonan.
Yes, sir. I think another important element of the problem that we have is China's probably one of their major suppliers, in that the end-use checks agreement that we have between the U.S. and China is largely inadequate, if not totally inadequate. We only have one export control officer to do the verification, so that if we want to follow up on any export to China after it's been made, and it's unique to China, it's not like this with any of our other trading partners. So they only have one export control officer on mainland China to do any post-shipment verification checks. When I did a research paper on this for the Secretary of Defense, they were averaging 55 checks per year. I think it's even gone down because they were refusing them last year until we put them on the unverified list and then moved them over to the entity list, which was a good thing, but it just shows how difficult that problem is. So there's no mechanism in place to ultimately check who's the ultimate end user. So it invites diversion to internally within China or to North Korea or to, in the case that you just offered, Iran.
May I add a point? It's a really
Yes,
important
please.
point, and I want to tease it out. And I want something for this committee to know. The end-use checks in China are authorized by MOFCOM. When I was at the International Trade Administration at the Commerce Department, it's MOFCOM who also audits our trade checks to ensure compliance. MOFCOM allowed me to go into a company for 3 weeks and unearth anything I could to make sure that there's no trade violation. And I can tell you that I still hold the record at the Commerce Department for failing every Chinese company I ever audited because I always found the smoking gun, and none of that was ever litigated. But going back to the main point, MOFCOM restricts BIS's end-use checks. Half a day, they can barely look at anything. A MOFCOM official has to be there. And we're saying, and then we were just talking about how much China is responsible for diversion. Mr. Wolf says we need to give BIS more money. Okay, maybe I can see some arguments for that having merit, but you give the end-use check people more money. There are not, how many people do you think you can put in China, even if you had one person at every single company, there is no way they could find all the ways that China, and they're very sneaky, misuse and divert and exploit our export control rules. So let's be pragmatic and realistic about this. No matter how many people you put there, we're not going to catch what they're doing.
And in my last 20-plus seconds, I want to stay with you on this, Ms. Nataktar. The de minimis rule threshold for China is 25%, substantially higher than the other adversaries like Iran, North Korea, Cuba, and those I had mentioned previously. What does that mean, and what should it be?
It basically means that you can just, you take a gaming computer with exquisite semiconductor chips, you send that to China, no license, China sends it to Russia, they take all of it out, right? It's absurd we're doing. China is not like other countries, right? China is a foreign adversary. We really need our rules to reflect that. I would take it down. Like I said, I would also add the see-through rule. Look, I'll be frank, I don't want to export anything sensitive to China or anything for that matter to a genocidal regime that's also threatening to harm the United States and our allies. I would take it all the way down to zero. I don't want anything to get into China any way, shape, or form.
You're definitely one of my favorite panelists so far. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Mills. The chair now recognizes Ms. Dean for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Mast and Ranking Member Crow, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today and testifying and offering us your expertise and your passion around these issues. I just want to backtrack a little on something that was just discussed in terms of Russia deploying Iranian-made unmanned aerial vehicles in Ukraine, discovered in September of 2022. Assistant Secretary Wolf, isn't it true that the Biden administration established a task force to investigate that and then, I believe, promulgated a rule to target Iran's supply to Russia? Could you just confirm or tell me?
Yes, absolutely. So a couple months ago, a rule was published using something called the Foreign Direct Product Rule. Foreign-made items made with U.S. technology or equipment, if going into items destined to Iran or for use in a UAV for Russia, even though not from the U.S. and not U.S. origin content, are now subject to U.S. export controls as a result of a new rule to address that exact point. There's massive increase in resources to track down diversion and distributors and third parties involved in chips and other items making their way into such items into Russia. And so, yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. I wanted to follow up, Mr. Wolf, on the ending of your testimony. And I read in your testimony that you were surprised to see the BIS fiscal year 2024 budget for export control policy and enforcement efforts remaining flat. You go on to say everyone agrees that BIS and export controls are central to strategic and classical national security and foreign policy objectives. BIS's budget should reflect that position and be equally serious. So what are some of the specific areas where you think BIS could urgently use some additional funding, staffing, and expertise?
Thank you for noticing. So, compliments to the previous administration for substantial increases in the BIS budget since when I was there. I don't know the story behind the budget. Just in reading it, I saw it's flat. And for everybody calling for more activity and more controls and more research and more analysts, there should be equally large number of people adding to the ranks of BIS and to the other export control agencies, the Defense Technology Security Administration, State Department's ISN and DDTC, and the Department of Energy's NNSA require equal attention as well. So you need more people doing data analytics. The rules are far more complex and the diversion potential higher. You need dramatically more enforcement resources to follow up on leads and track down and work with the allies with every new country and every new bilateral issue. And this idea that I have about substantially expanded ways of thinking to control items far beyond the classical multilateral regimes, that requires more interaction, more diplomacy, more negotiation with the allies. This is in addition to just governing and administering the regular licensing system so that things can move through as quickly as possible within the needs of the various agencies. So I would basically sort of top to bottom, I think the demands on BIS now are radically and substantially different than they were when I was there, and certainly in the 1990s when the current system was established.
Ma'am,
and
excuse me, may I make an observation?
Well, I just want to follow up
Oh, I'm
on that,
sorry.
if you don't mind. Mr. Wolf, do you have either a percentage that the budget should be increased or a dollar figure, any kind of an estimate?
No, I'm not smart enough at the inside baseball of the current budgets, but, you know, at least a doubling. I mean, some very radical, substantial increases, doubled, quadruple. I mean, the volume of activity being run through BIS and the significance of all the issues everybody has properly laid out today warrants, you know, dramatically larger staff. And so at least a doubling of their current budget and the resources and the people and the expertise to go along with it.
I have another area of interest, but do you want 10 seconds? Tell us what you wanted to add.
Yes, 10 seconds. There's a common thread here. The foundation for how the EAR is applied from all this licensing enforcement is the classification system. So in response to your question about resources, to the extent BIS has authorities, there should be significant resources devoted to the proper classification and the development of the Commerce Control List.
I thank you for that. And then very quickly, I'm very concerned, I know the world is concerned, frankly, about fentanyl, the precursors coming from China. If you could shed any light, Mr. Wolf, in the just 20 seconds I have remaining, on what is going on there. I met yesterday with Secretary Blinken. We now know that the precursors are coming into Mexico, and of course, cartels and others are mixing them.
A serious, horrible issue. I'm glad you're focusing on it, but I'm not the expert in how to address the situation. Apologies.
Anybody else? 10 seconds.
Yeah, I mean, we have trading agreements with Mexico. Mexico has to step up and do the enforcement it needs. It's ridiculous that we have maintained open borders, but they're not willing to do their part. It's absolutely, it's a good
Well,
question.
I would
good
push back on the open borders piece, but thank you. You're right. We have to partner with
But
Mexico.
trading borders, not people, right?
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Dean. Chair now recognizes my favorite Green Beret. I'm just kidding. He's not my favorite.
Thank you,
Mr. Waltz from Florida.
Yeah, I just want to share some of the concerns that we've heard on the committee that I think with our current construct, we're sitting kind of in the worst of both worlds. Our allies are frustrated. I see actual promotional advertising materials saying, buy our stuff. It literally says it may not be as good as the Americans, but you don't have to deal with their export controls. Then on the other hand, we literally see our greatest adversary, the PRC, rolling out item after item after item, from drones to hypersonics. We can go down the list that look exactly like ours, and in some cases are performing better. So we have a construct that's frustrating our allies and enhancing our adversaries for all kinds of reasons. I want to take my time, though, to drill down on the operating committee. We've talked a lot about commerce today, but the Department of Defense has a say in this. Energy and state have a say on this, and I find it striking, and have throughout my career, that when the agencies disagree, it elevates to the operating committee, and because the Department of Commerce is both chair and a member, they basically have the overwrite. And so there's a lot of concern, and I share the concern that Commerce is overweighted in its power when it comes to application determinations, and these are the very few that actually even go to the operating committee, separate issue, because of Commerce's position. And according to our data, from 2017 to 2019, there was a 60% increase of licensing decisions made by Commerce as the chair of the operating committee without the consensus of the Department of Defense, State, and Energy. And then furthermore, 10% of that, the chair made its decision with the support of only one of the other agencies. So I guess my question is, if we don't go to necessarily default no, which I wouldn't be opposed to, but if we don't go to default no, I think we should go to default consensus. And that particularly if the Defense Department has serious national security concerns. So Mr. Coonan, do you think that harmonization of the sanctions lists, because we also have all kinds of different lists that don't match, where the Defense Department can say, we have all of these concerns on these items or even these companies, and then Commerce can say, thank you very much, but we're going to do it anyway. Do you think the harmonization of those lists across U.S. agencies could help with these issues, and particularly with PRC diversion of technology?
Sir, I absolutely think that the harmonization of those lists would help. I also think that the rules the BIS is not doing anything that is not permitted in the rules, and so those rules need to change. And that's why in my paper, one of the recommendations is to rebalance some of the authorities with the other departments. So for example, with the Department of Defense, they should have potentially a veto or a greater sway, if you will, when it comes to items that are controlled for national security reasons or for anti-terrorism. And it's the same for the Department of State. They should have a bigger vote, if you will, when it comes to issues or for technologies that are controlled for regional security reasons or for some of the non-proliferation regimes.
Ms. Nakakdar, do you have anything to add there?
One of my recommendations was, it's ridiculous that Commerce has an outside vote. These other agencies have the expertise, including the equities, right, to weigh in. I think that my recommendation was, and rather than it go to the assistant secretary who has for licensing, who has an imbalanced view at BIS, because the enforcement guys, like I said, are pretty forward-leaning. That once it's escalated, the undersecretary who can represent both equities gets a vote, but then every agency gets a vote in the appeal process. And if you need a tiebreaker, you go to the National Security Council. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ginelli. You have anything? Okay, great. Mr. Chairman, I have legislation that I look forward to marking up through this subcommittee and committee that would do just that and harmonizing these lists and hopefully really getting our arms around this problem. We cannot, I sit on armed services as well, we cannot spend, and science and technology, $900 billion a year advancing into the most advanced technologies in the world to watch it literally walk right out the back door. I look forward to this committee's support. Thank you. I yield my time.
I thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. I think we did all get a great deal out of this. I thank the staff for their research on this as well. I think there's a broad consensus that there are gaps. There's different solutions on how to fix those gaps and fill those holes, but certainly a broad consensus that there are very serious issues for us to deal with. I look forward to marking up the legislation of Mr. Waltz and any other ideas that members of the committee will have in dealing and addressing this issue. Members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we'll ask that you respond to these additional questions in writing. And in that, I now recognize Mr. Crow for any closing remarks that you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate you calling this important hearing, and thank you to all the witnesses for taking time out of your busy work schedules to have this discussion with us and to have a robust back and forth. And I agree with you, Mr. Chairman, that I think we do all share the same goal, that is to balance American competitiveness and make sure that American businesses are robust and thriving at the leading edge of technology, and we protect their technology. At the same time, we address our adversaries' threats, particularly Russia and China, but also others that pose that threat. And we might disagree on how to get there and some of the steps, and like you said so well, where those gaps are and maybe why they exist, but look forward to continuing that discussion to figure out where we can find some common ground and address it in the best interests of the United States and our shared constituents. So with that, I thank you again and yield back.
Pursuant to committee rules, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length of limitations. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned. Thanks, guys.